Welcome to our 9-lesson series called Pulling G's, where we'll study fighter pilot perspectives on faith. My name is Hugh Vest, my call sign is Huge, and I'm a retired fighter pilot with over 4,000 hours. I'll be your guide or your instructor pilot for this journey. So strap inside a $40 million F-16 Viper and come with me for an insider's look at the tactics, training, and technology behind 21st century aerial combat. This study will take a warrior's perspective on faith that will hopefully inspire you in spiritual combat with the same things, the same tools that make for a leading-edge fighter pilot. Each chapter in this series will start with real cockpit insights, and from there we'll move on to everyday life faith applications, and we'll end with debrief questions for you or your group to look at. So some things we'll talk about is we'll debrief your life's mission. Like a fighter pilot, we'll strain on the G-forces of this world. We'll study the tactics of our adversary. We'll learn to trust our instrument in faith. We'll also learn to know our -1 checklist for life. We'll see through the black world using our Creator's night vision goggles. We'll explore the call signs of God. And then we'll also look at hangar flying lessons in faith from some of the pioneers out there. So again, as fighter pilots would say, fights on. So before we get into the series and are in chapter 1 and press on with all the other chapters, I'd like to do what we call some administrative details, or admin as fighter pilots call it. So a couple things. First thing is I'd like it, if you get a chance, to take a look at the book, Pulling G's, Fighter Pilot Perspectives in Faith. And I'm the author, Hugh Vest. And this book actually has more chapters in it. It has all the lessons in it, but additional details. And then the good thing is it's also a short read. So I just encourage you to pick it up. It's available on crosslinkpublishing.com. Or if you want to talk to your local Christian bookstore, it's available through the Ingram Distribution Network. And so I'd like to encourage you there to pick up the book if you can. A couple other things is I'd like to thank the Air Force for the chance to do this, and they actually were able to review the material in the book, in which I'll be presenting here, and then found that it's within Air Force policy. And I do have to remind you that none of the views that I'll talk about here represent the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force, so I have to offer that disclaimer. And additionally, there is no classified or sensitive data in any of these. And then finally, I'd like to thank YouTube for giving me this free opportunity to pass on these lessons to you, for you to look at and hopefully enjoy and join me in this journey. So again, welcome. Join me in this journey, and we'll get into chapter 1 and following on chapters here. So fights on.
Okay, just a demonstration of night vision. This is the airport grounds. At night with normal vision camera. Over here with a little bit of extra light, but there's a helicopter you can't see. I can't anyway, not through this camera. And we'll see what the difference is with night vision. Well, I also want to look up the sky as well, which right now we're looking up about 40 degrees and I see nothing, but try again here in a second. Here's the same helicopter. And I don't know if it's in focus or not. Have to check it out. And we'll go up that 40 degrees again, look at the sky.
So MVG technology is pretty cool, isn't it? It gives you an extreme advantage in flying. So when I started flying with night vision goggles or NVGs back quite a while ago, obviously they were heavy. They're lighter now. We actually had different cockpit modifications for flying with them. At first, we had actually a string of what they called green Christmas lights in the cockpit to keep the inside from glaring too much so we could focus on looking outside. And so they just added these to the cockpit, kind of a modification. And then as we advanced with night vision goggles, they actually adjusted the actual lights themselves in the cockpit to display a kind of green shade and more of an NVG friendly color. And they also did the same thing for the outside lights. Initially, we flew with our lights out, so you would actually turn your lights completely black and you could see the other aircraft, just two little small lights on them is all you could see from that aircraft. So it's pretty amazing flying next to an aircraft basically lights out, and you could still see them and fly off them with night vision goggles. But later on, we actually developed lights that were MVIS or MVG friendly, and so they could actually turn on a set of lights on their aircraft that would illuminate it, but you couldn't see them underneath your goggles. But if you look through your goggles, you could actually see the lights of the aircraft. So I actually started flying with MVGs. I had over 2,000 hours in the F-16 when I started flying with them. So it took me a little bit as an old guy getting used to them more than actually just getting a new guy used to them. It's probably a little tougher on the old guys. But we developed and got used to actually flying with them, knowing what to see. We had to, obviously, you have to move your cranium more because you don't have any peripheral vision necessarily with those. But we'd fly low levels eventually with them at certain levels. And you could see, it's just amazing what you could make out on the ground. You could see a campfire for 20, 30 miles away from the enemy. You could look up and see the stars. And just, you could see every star. It's like the most beautiful night you ever imagined with stars. So it brought out, basically, it turned not quite the night into day. People say it did that, but it wasn't quite. Obviously, there's some adjustments to be made. But in a sense, in terms of revolution and warfare, it definitely did turn night into day in some perspectives. And the big thing was for night vision is it gave you a tactical advantage, and most importantly, it gave you a new perspective. And so that's really where we want to go with this. So the question I pose to you as we go into our application is, what if we were given basically God's goggles, so God's MVGs? What if He gave us a pair of His goggles to look through this dark world and see His perspective? What do you think we'd see if we looked into the world using God, using Christ's perspective? For one thing, I think as we do this, is the world really spiritually is in a state of night, in a state of darkness. And darkness itself has a lot of spiritual connotations. And you can even imagine it implies, in the darkness we lose direction or bearing, right? It's difficult to navigate if we don't have some way to see or some light. We end up stumbling around a lot. I did some survival stuff in the night, and we didn't have night vision goggles, and so we ended up stumbling a lot through the night in the woods, without much orientation. Darkness also symbolizes fear, uncertainty, panic, and some of the things it also kind of implies evil, because darkness can hide things, so we can hide. If things aren't illuminated, we can hide better. We can, all the things that are useful for tactics are also useful for as symbology for a darkened spiritual world. And if you just imagine that Midianite camp, that is kind of how it was, how darkness is, where they're in fear all of a sudden, because there are these sounds and stuff at night. So they've lost direction. They turn on themselves. They're hiding. All these things. It symbolizes the evil world out there, and our world, and the world that we live in that's darkened spiritually. So a verse for that, I think, is Ephesians 4, 17 through 19, and it talks about this. It says, "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more." And so that's kind of the spiritual darkness. So the opposite of spiritual darkness is light, is the day, is light, is illuminated through the goggles, through night vision goggles. And so spiritually, light stands for the opposite of darkness. So light stands for, instead of a lack of direction, it stands for direction, for truth. It also stands for everything being exposed, right? Everything's opened. If you're trying to hide in the darkness and suddenly you take a flashlight there, it's exposed. Whatever you're doing in the dark is suddenly there. If the light comes on, in a room, all of a sudden everything's instantly exposed there. So light also positively gives us direction. It gives us hope. It's a beacon, something we go to. Like if we're in the darkness and we see a beacon, we go towards that light. So it shines. It's something we lean to. So light spiritually is an awesome thing. And a good verse for that is John 8:12. So the book of John, chapter 8, verse 12. And it says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Light stands for life spiritually out there. So when we think about light, one of the things is, how do we, if we say we want to see God's perspective, if we want to put on God's MVGs in the darkness, how do we do that? How do we walk through the dark world using God's goggles and to illuminate His perspective? How do we find God's perspective through His goggles in life? So I think the way we do this is a lot like we bring MVGs into the cockpit. So the instrument themselves, the actual MVGs that illuminate God's perspective in this dark world, is through Jesus Christ. So it's through Christ that we see the world. When we put on His lenses, that we see the world in an illuminated perspective. So Christ is our MVGs. And then what we do is we study the manual just like we do for night vision training. We train in employment, and then we take them into combat in the dark. And that's what we do with God's perspective. We study His perspective, study Christ's perspective, and where do we find that? Obviously, in our spiritual flight manual for faith, which is the Holy Bible. So we study the training manual, the Bible. We train in employment. We practice and think through our lives and applying God's perspective to these different situations in life. And then we take them into the world, into the darkened world. So that's kind of how we do it. So let's just kind of give some examples of illuminating God's perspective in the dark. I have a few situations, kind of things we think about, and we can see what kind of the world's dark perspective is, and then what's God's perspective. So is your consuming desire in life to make money, to accumulate wealth, and buy the best things for your own gain? So the darkened world out there pounds it into our minds, right? The good life's out there, and it's just one purchase away. So Christ's perspective, obviously, is different on that. So if you go to the book of Luke, chapter 16, 13 through 16, it says, Jesus says, "You cannot serve both God and money. God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight." So God's perspective is a little bit different on that than the world's perspective. So another perspective, how about this? Are power, influence, position, and authority over others your life's goal? You know, the world wants you to believe that you are the center of your universe, and the ultimate goal is to achieve the admiration of others. Well, Christ shows us something different, right? Through His MVGs, through His lenses. In Matthew, the book, chapter 23, 11 through 12, Christ says, "The greatest among you will be your servant." Quite different. "For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." So again, a different perspective. Christ's goggles show us a different perspective on the world. Okay, here's one more. Are strength, health, physical beauty, and a chiseled physique your desire? Is that what you want? When Christ entered the world, He Himself actually had no beauty or majesty to attract us to Him. Nothing in His appearance that we should desire Him. And so Christ's perspective on the vanity of spending all our time on our own physical health and beauty, he writes, and as Paul writes, and this is from the Bible, book of Galatians 2, chapter 2, verse 6. He says, "As for those who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearances." So putting all of our life into our external appearance is something through Christ's perspective is not something that we need to do. Here's one other. Does our stumbling and disillusioned and darkened world call you wise? Are you puffed up with degrees and pride and science and philosophy, technology, academic quests and achievements? The reality, if we look through Christ's eyes, is the wisdom of God is in the faith of a child. And so God tells us through His perspective on the wisdom of this world. He says in the book of Matthew 11, verses 23, chapter 11, verses 25 through 26, He says, "I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth." I love this verse. "Because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and you revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure." So the wisdom of God often comes through faith and not through the wisdom and darkened wisdom of men. And so all kinds of situations that we encounter, I think, in life, if it's different when we look through God's perspective, through Christ's MVGs, through the lens of our flight manual in faith, the Holy Bible, and they give you a whole different perspective. And so I think we need to take a day out sometime and try to just live one day through the eyes of Christ and see what that would be like. I think it would change the way we live and think about our faith and our spiritual journey. I have one last poem I'd like to read for you. And this is one of my favorite poems. This is written during the Civil War by a anonymous soldier during the Civil War, and writes this poem. And I think this poem really illuminates the difference in God's MVGs and God's perspective on our darkened world, and sometimes what the world's perspective is. So here's the poem. It says, I asked God for strength that I might achieve. I was made weak that I might learn humbly to obey. I asked for health that I might do greater things. I was given sickness that I might do better things. I asked for riches that I might be happy. I was given poverty that I might be wise. I asked for power that I might have the praise of men, and I was given weakness that I might feel the need of God. I asked for all things that I might enjoy life, and I was given life that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing that I'd asked for, but everything I'd hoped for. Almost despite myself, my unspoken prayers were answered, and I am, among all men, most richly blessed. I look forward to seeing you in chapter 6.